When you are exhausted, oftentimes it is hard to be the best version of yourself, right? You're just done. He's been at war. It's been days of fighting. They are chasing enemy combatants on foot. It's 300 men chasing 15,000 men. As those men scatter, the 300 men are having to do the mop-up duty of the remaining and fleeing army. This is exhausting. They're in rugged, rough terrain. They've not slept in days. They're dehydrated. They are frustrated. And they stop and they ask people who are supposed to be helpful, hey, we're fighting for you. We're fighting for your freedom. We're trying to liberate our nation. Can you feed us? No. There's always some disgusting people in every culture that have disdain for those who serve in the armed forces. And they don't treat them with the dignity, honor, and respect that they should. And that's what happens here. It's a dishonor, a disregard, and a disrespect. And this is the exhaustion test. Under this exhaustion, how is Gideon going to respond? And what he does is he doesn't exactly pass this test. Because what he says is to the one town, I'm going to come back and I'm going to whip you publicly. Okay, now what this brings to mind is somebody else in the Bible was whipped publicly. Who was that? Jesus. So if you're the guy doing the whipping, you're probably on the wrong side. Okay, so they whip Jesus, and this is before the coming of Jesus, and he's going to whip them like later the Roman soldiers would whip Jesus. So what he's doing here is not right, because in addition, he's going to publicly humiliate people who are part of his own nation and part of his own religion. And instead, what we see here as well, this is in the two towns of Succoth, which it had to, I mean, you knew these guys were going to blow it, right? You're like, hey, he went to Succoth. You're like, I'm sure they're no good, you know. They probably sucketh, you know. So we kind of saw that coming. But Succoth, it means booths or tents. How many of you like to camp? Okay, the Feast of Booths or Tents was when they all went camping. Okay, and so this was an ancient feast named after this town. And in this place, Succoth, which means booths or tents, it's where Jacob and Esau met face to face in Genesis. And so they established something called the Feast of Booths, where they'd go camping together and they would worship God as a holiday. So this was a place that God's people were very familiar with, and it was a place where they would go for the holidays and they would go to worship God. Question, does Gideon stop and worship God? No, he's exhausted. Let me say this, sometimes when you're exhausted, you don't feel like worshiping God, but that's probably the time you need to worship him the most. And Gideon is thinking, I've got so much to do. I've got a battle. I've got requirements and people depending on me. I don't have time to stop and worship. Well, you're going to make a lot of bad decisions if you're exhausted and you don't stop to worship. In addition, he then stops at the town of Penuel, which literally means the face of God. And it means that's where you meet face to face with God. And it's where Jesus and a guy named Jacob back in Genesis, they wrestled. And so Jacob came face to face with Jesus Christ. And so literally, this is the place where ultimately God's people created a worship center, and they would come from all around the nation to Penuel to worship God and to come face to face with their God. So these two sites are denoted for worship. They're places that God's people would come to worship. In this instance, question, are the people there, led by their leaders, are they worshiping God? No. God's servants, God's soldiers show up. And he's asking something very simple. Could you feed the army that is fighting for you? The answer is no, because they have fear of man. They are now failing the test that Gideon just passed. And what they say is, have you won the victory yet? Because if the victory is not yet won, if we support you and you lose, then we're going to have a fight with the Midianites. What they're trying to do is play both sides of the fight. If you win, we'll support you. If you lose, we won't. There are many people like this in our world. These are the fair weather fans. These are the swallow Christians that leave when winter comes. These are the people who don't want to come out of the proverbial closet and say, I belong to Jesus Christ. Instead, what they're going to wait and see is, where does the wind of culture take them and what will cause them the least trouble? They're cowards. So they're not worshiping. But in addition, when Gideon arrives with his 300 men, does he lead his men in worship? No. No, the point is this: just because you're in a broken, disgusting culture doesn't mean that you can't worship there, because someone needs to. The best thing that Gideon could have done here, he could have stopped and said, Succoth, Penuel, you are known for worship and you're not worshiping God. But me and my men, we are now going to worship God, whether you worship him or not. And you can join us or not. He doesn't do that. Previous, chapter 6 and 7, he meets with Jesus, he prays, he hears from God, he gets clothed in the Holy Spirit, he builds an altar and he worships God. Chapter 8 is the only chapter of the 3-chapter narrative of Gideon where he doesn't stop and worship God. Let me say this: sometimes we forget to worship God when we're exhausted. It's the end of a long day. You're like, I haven't prayed all day. You've had a hard, long week and you're just sort of spent. You're like, you know what? I'm not going to church this week. I'm just too tired. Or you've got little kids and they're up all night. And I don't know why. People say, just by the way, I've got grandsons I love with my whole heart, but people say like, I slept like a baby. It's like, well, you've obviously never met a baby because they're up all night. They're very small vampires. They're only asleep during the day. Okay, and so you can be in life, and how many of you, we've come to a point where even for a season, we're just overwhelmed and exhausted. We just forget to pray and read our Bible and spend time in God's presence and come to church. This is going to be the beginning of his problem.
Howdy, Pastor Mark here. Thanks for viewing the clip. And if you'd like the entire sermon, we've got it ready to go.